It appears to me that we simultaneously inhabit in two different worlds. One is what I might call a complicated world, where much of the issues could be dealt with our professional trainings, through acquired life experiences, through heuristics, through our own practices, be it hardware or software. We have a pretty good command of the problem space, as the practitioners like to say. We have good experience developing solution spaces. The second world turns out to be the complex world, where a lot of things emerge. You do not have the capability to detect surprises. You do not even have the cognitive capacity to understand the broader interconnections between these various systems. These complex worlds are systems of systems. We are yet to get good at that. In fact, we need new strategies, new approaches, new models of leadership. And a professional area of practice that deals with this all the time is military. In fact, think of all the case studies that are out there that think about leadership. You cannot imagine them without the influence of the military on it. In fact, military seems to be operating at the crosscuts of the complicated world and the complex world. General Stanley McChrystal, who led the operations against Al-Qaeda in 2003, recently called or highlighted the importance of teams. That seems to be the structure of our evolving society, where engineering is not just a team profession, but it's operating in the form of teams. How do we do that? And I don't think we are there yet. Barry Shoop has thought quite a bit about this subject. It's a Stanford PhD. He has built satellite communication systems. He has worked as a CTO for a multi-billion-dollar defense organization. He's a professor and chairman at the West Point U.S. Military Academy. He's also the president and CEO of IEEE. It is my personal honor to invite Barry Shoop on stage and reflect with us on some of the complicated issues that we're facing.
So I will begin by sharing a little bit here. Confess, this is a little bit uncomfortable for me. As the IEEE president, normally I am invited to come to places and give talks, and then I'm asked, what do I want to do? How long do I want to talk? What do I want to talk about? You will notice that I have no slide changers. Okay, I've been given some constraints today by my good friend Guru. No slides, storytelling, and talk about yourself and your career. Very uncomfortable for me to do. So I just want to let you know that I'm taking a little risk today. We're going to assess it at the end and see whether this works or not. I may have to change this in the future. So I'm going to talk about leadership. I'm going to talk about leadership from a couple of different perspectives. I'm going to begin by talking to you about how you can become a leader. Okay, this is a leadership forum. Questions are, how do I, as a student, I can't even imagine becoming a leader. How do I go about doing that? So I'm going to talk about a framework that you can use to become a leader, an effective leader. I'm going to talk about some traits of effective leaders, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about my career. Not about me so much, but I'm going to take those traits and that framework, and I'm going to try to relate to you how that was instantiated in my career in two different examples. So for those of you that are taking notes, and I notice a lot of people taking notes, I applaud you for that. The framework that I'm going to talk about is all about something called transformational leadership. So if you want to be a leader, you can study, you can acquire skills to be an effective leader. There's three very simple parts to this framework. The first part is acquiring new knowledge, and I'll talk about these a little bit. Acquiring new knowledge. The second part is gaining some experience. And then the third is reflection. This is what we teach at West Point. It's been fairly effective since 1802. So if you go back and you look at acquiring new knowledge, how do you acquire new knowledge? Being here at this forum is one way of doing that. Listening to others in terms of what worked for them, in terms of leadership, those kinds of things. You can read books. There's lots of books out there on leadership. Pick up a book and read it. There's articles on it. There's an interesting point for gaining experience and new knowledge in terms of leadership that comes from this thing that we call a world laboratory. You can observe other leaders. It's an important concept. And observing other leaders, there are two kinds of leaders. There are good leaders and there are not so good leaders, poor leaders. You can learn from both good leaders and poor leaders. Okay? So that's acquiring new knowledge. A whole bunch of different ways of doing that. The second part of this process, this framework, is actually experience. So you can read all the books, you can get all the theory, but if you don't actually apply it, you don't get it inside. So practicing leadership is particularly important. Well, where do you practice leadership? Many of you that are students are already engaged in this. If you are engaged in a capstone design project, team kind of activities in your school, your university, leadership emerges from there. So you have an opportunity to practice leadership there. Student branch activities, being a leader in a student branch, a local section within IEEE. IEEE gives lots of opportunities to practice leadership. So you take those theories that you learn from acquiring new knowledge, and then you apply them. You basically get some experience with that. The third part of this is particularly important. It's reflection. So you've got the new theory, you've tried it, and then you need to step back and you need to take an opportunity to think about, did it work? What could I have done better? How shall I do this the next time? It's very, very important. In the Army, we talk about after-action reviews, after-action reports. Okay? Operation goes down, we step back and we figure out what went right, what went wrong, how do we prevent the things that went wrong from going wrong again the next time. That's a cyclic process, and a cyclic process that goes throughout your entire career. Okay? So that's the framework. There are some traits to leadership, and again, you can pick up some texts and you can read these texts. There's a whole long list of traits. I'm going to pick out the ones that I think are the most important. First one is basically being honorable. Okay? It's probably the most important trait of a good leader. You heard things like transparency, honor, high moral character. Okay? Leaders that are effective leaders have high moral character. So do your assessment. Make sure you're on the right path. Things like trust and respect are particularly important traits for leaders to have. Now, what I will tell you is that trust and respect are earned. You're not leading yourself, you're leading a team. You're participating in a team. So trust and respect are important. You've heard a lot in this past 2 days talking about lifelong learning. Learning is very, very important in terms of what we're doing. What I will tell you is that, we'll go back to the military analogy, H. Norman Schwarzkopf said, leadership is about coupling strategy and character. And if you have to make a decision of one, stick with character. It's the most important thing that you can get. Lifelong learning, John F. Kennedy said, leadership and learning are indispensable to one another. So as you go through your professional career, your personal career, lifelong learning is particularly important. So now what I'd like to do is I'd like to kind of give you some background on myself. Okay, this is one of those things I'm never comfortable talking about myself or talking about my career or my background. I'll give you a tale of two stories, or a tale of two jobs, if you will, separated by 26 years in terms of my career. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tie back some of the things that I talked about earlier. I graduated from Penn State University in 1980. That makes me mature, not old, okay? Okay, I'm very, very, very mature. Graduated in 1980, Bachelor of Science degree in electrical engineering. I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Army, and I was shipped off to my first duty assignment. My first duty assignment was as a communication electronic engineer working on the Defense Satellite Communication System. It was the state-of-the-art satellite communication system in the Department of Defense. So I was a brand new electrical engineer, and I was put into a prototype facility. I had 6 technicians working for me. Okay, 2 of the technicians had more experience than I had years on the planet. Okay, so you talk about leadership challenges. I was put in charge of these technicians and this very advanced state-of-the-art communication system. So the first thing I learned very quickly is that lifelong learning is real, and it comes quicker in some cases than you would expect. So I got there. I had a pretty good degree from Penn State. I'd taken signals and systems, electromagnetic fields and waves. I had done all of the kinds of things. Great capstone. And I got there, and I was dealing with advanced A to D converters, multiplexers and demultiplexers. I was dealing with advanced error correction coding schemes and systems, spread spectrum communication, both direct sequence, spread spectrum, as well as code division multiplexing. They did not teach me any of that at Penn State. And so I found myself at a huge disadvantage. I'm supposed to be in charge of a prototype facility where we were installing systems, configuring and installing systems in the world. And so I spent a tremendous amount of time at night and on weekends poring over textbooks, my old notes, as well as operating manuals from the manufacturers. Probably in the first year that I was there, I asked more questions than I answered questions. But what I will tell you is that by doing that, I learned a tremendous amount from those technicians, okay? So that's the first thing. Lifelong learning is real, and it's up front. The second thing that the ROTC and the Army had taught me earlier was that you needed to be with your troops. You needed to be engaged with your team. And so I took the opportunity to be with those technicians everywhere that they were, to try to build trust and respect. When we went to the field to install systems, we installed them in the mud, in the rain, in the cold, and I was there with the technicians pulling cables, helping them, and I was able to gain the trust and respect from the folks, the team that I was leading. So there's some concepts there that you need to think about as you build your team. You need to be part of the team. I took up playing darts. I had never played darts in my life, but my team played darts. So we played darts, we ate together. That's how you build trust. That's how you build a team. Okay? So in terms of leadership, particularly important. So that all seemed to work. I succeeded there. I actually got promoted, so it was a good news story. Let me fast forward now 26 years. So that was 1980. In 2006, I was a professor at West Point. I was running the electrical engineering program. Life was pretty good. I had a stable environment. I had a master's degree. I had a PhD. And then one day, I got pulled out of West Point as the chief scientist for this organization in the Department of Defense. It was in the Secretary of Defense's office, and I was assigned as the chief scientist for this organization. $4.5 billion organization. In 2006, it was at the height of the Iraq War. The biggest problem that U.S. forces on the ground were having was dealing with IEDs, improvised explosive devices. Brand new organization stood up in the Secretary of Defense's office, and I was picked. I was pulled out of West Point to be the chief scientist for that. Didn't volunteer for it, didn't even know I was being considered for it. Got a notification one day that said, congratulations, you're going to be the new chief scientist for this 4-star. And within 2 hours, I had orders. I called my wife and I said, hon, I got some good news and some bad news. And she goes, okay, well, give me the bad news first. I said, well, I'm being deployed. She goes, okay. I said, well, the good news is it's to Washington, to the Pentagon. Good news story. So I went into this, and again, I will talk about lifelong learning. So as the chief scientist for this organization, I walked in I got some briefings in terms of what was going on in the organization, and I quickly figured out that I did not have all of the skills and knowledge that I needed. So we were dealing with things like, I'm a communication background kind of a person. When you deal with explosive devices, roadside bombs, you're dealing with chemistry. So I had to pull out my old chemistry book from 1979, pulled out the periodic table. Don't ever forget the periodic table. It's incredibly important, okay? Pulled out the periodic table, pored over the periodic table, trying to understand compounds, composition of explosives, to try to figure out what kind of off-gassing they have, the chemicals have, so that you can try to detect them. Chemistry. I had to go back, didn't spend a lot of time with mechanical engineering, but when you start dealing with things that go boom and blast, you have to worry about blast, how the explosive goes off, the blast itself, and then blast protection for both vehicles as well as personnel. I had to deal with electrical engineering, but a very broad spectrum of electrical engineering. Very, very detail-oriented electronics. If you have sensitive electronics someplace on the battlefield, how do you go about sensing those? To radar systems, to communication systems, to jamming systems, high-power jamming systems, that entire spectrum. Things like physics, pretty important kinds of things when you deal with explosive kinds of things. We even got into psychology, because if you are looking all the time for devices that are on the ground, you are finding one device at a time. If you step back and abstract yourself a little bit and you begin looking at the network, think about a social network. How do we determine who's part of this network, and how do we determine who the financiers are, who the bomb makers are, and who the emplacers are? And so in terms of network science, that became a particularly important component. So what I will tell you is that it caused me to spend many hours at night and on weekends studying all of these things. I had about 30 scientists and engineers that worked for me, each one that had very detailed knowledge within the area. I asked them as many questions as I asked my technicians previously to try to get myself up to speed. So lifelong learning is particularly important. This was the most intense job that I've had in the Army for my career, with the exception of some small periods when mortar fire and rocket fire and small arms fire came about. This was intense because we were dealing with human life. On a daily basis, we got reports from Iraq and Afghanistan of soldiers that were dying and that were being maimed on the battlefield. So this was an incredibly intense period for me and for everybody that worked on the team. So lifelong learning is important when we talk about respect and we talk about trust and how you build respect and trust. It's not about your position. As a colonel in the United States Army, I still am, I had lots of opportunity to allow other people to do things, to go places, see things, bring the information back. It's about leading by walking beside the people that you're leading. That's the part of leadership that builds trust and respect. So while I was deployed to the Pentagon and to Washington, I spent a good deal of time in Iraq and Afghanistan and some other places to see the environment and to be where my team was. That's how you go about building trust and respect and confidence in terms of your team. So that's kind of my background. That's my story. I've got just a couple minutes here yet. What I will tell you is that you don't have to worry about it. You can become a leader, okay? Using this simple 3-element approach. Acquiring new knowledge, practicing. Please practice in IEEE. We need volunteers. We need young, new ideas. Practice and then reflect. Think about what worked and what didn't work, okay? Think about those traits. What I will leave you with is I will leave you with a challenge, okay? So this is my challenge to you. You've been here for almost 2 full days. You have learned, you have heard from, you have had an opportunity to engage with some truly world-class speakers. Myself excluded, okay? Really, truly world-class speakers. My challenge to you is in this cycle, in this process, in this framework of acquiring new knowledge, you have acquired new knowledge in this 2-day event. I'm going to ask you to reflect on that. When you go home, you go back to your universities, you go back to your businesses, think about this 2 days, okay? And what I want you to do is I want you to summarize that in your own mind, in your own words. What's important that you take out of this particular meeting in terms of leadership? What are you going to take away as future leaders? And I want you to send me an email. There's only 300 of you here, okay? Roughly. My email is easy. bbravo.shoop, S-H-O-O-P, @IEEE.org. Okay? Think about this. Reflect on it. This will be your step towards becoming a leader. If I get no emails, then this event was a great event in New Orleans, eating, drinking, going out on the river. Okay? If you're serious about being a leader and why you're here, send me an email with that synopsis, okay? And with that, Guru, thank you.
How many CEOs give out their email addresses in public? So do make use of this opportunity. Colonel, I've heard you speak many times, and I believe this is probably one of the most philosophical ones I've heard. So let's apply some philosophy to our thinking here. You're at the military academy. You guys are renowned in the practice of the Socratic method to help improve our thought process. Tell us a little bit more about that. How did it come into practice, and what are you most proud of?
So the Socratic Dialogue, you're talking about the Socratic Dialogue. So I started a course on disruptive innovation. I've been teaching it for almost 10 years now, and we use the Socratic Dialogue as part of that. And if you're not familiar with the Socratic Dialogue, Google it. It goes back to Socrates, Plato, the original philosophers. The Socratic Dialogue is all about arguing about ideas. Okay? And the reason that you argue about ideas is because if you are at a point where maybe you read something or you study something and you have to argue with somebody else about that or discuss that with somebody else, in order to have that conversation or to have that discussion or have that argument, you really have to internalize the concepts of that material. And you actually gain a much deeper understanding in terms of the material if you can engage in that Socratic dialogue. And so that's kind of one of those foundational components, part of learning, I think.
I sometimes worry that we are getting really, really good at the technicalities in engineering design and so forth. And, we've all been through the mind-numbing mathematics and so forth, but I think we are really getting good at that. One of the things that you talked about was very, very powerful, and I don't think we have made any progress toward that. It's about building or inculcating trust in team. Can you teach trust?
I don't think you can teach trust. As I said, trust is something that you have to gain from people that you engage with. You can teach this concept of leadership and the fact that you need trust in terms of your team members. I mean, in the military, trust is probably, I don't know, it's at the premium, but it's pretty high. If you have a combat team or if you have an infantry squad, you really have to trust the teammates in terms of that they are going to do what they're going to do. And part of that is the leadership in terms of building that team. So trust, I don't think you can teach trust, but you have to build a team where you gain trust across that team.
One final question, and this is requesting your personal view on this subject. We learned about hyperconnectivity from Monique today, and we talked about levels of abstraction from windsurf yesterday, and John Werner was kind enough to inform us about the onslaught of selfies in our culture. And it's a kind of takes us in the terrain of complexity. And yet there are institutions such as the military, or I would even say IEEE, who are struggling to adapt to these changing dynamics. How do we go about, I mean, the question is, what type of new leadership models may need to emerge going forward?
Great question. What I will tell you is we are struggling with that right now at West Point. I mean, when you have the ability of a cadet to send a text or an email to a 3-star general directly without going through the traditional chain of command, that changes the paradigm in terms of what you're doing. And so what I will say is we have many students as we teach leadership at West Point. We always go back to the basics in terms of leadership is a very personal kind of an engagement, as you heard in my talk. You don't send somebody an email giving them an order. You don't, if you're going to correct somebody, you don't send them an email. It's a personal engagement in terms of what you're doing. So we're struggling with this right now because of the hyperconnectivity and what's available. I will tell you that when we are in a combat zone, all of our cell phones are left at home because of the risk associated with that hyperconnectivity. What's going on in the operation, selfies in a combat zone is forbidden. You just that's not something that you do. But it's a technology, and the leadership to address that is a human dimension that we have to maintain.
Please don't go anywhere but to Barry Shoop.